All right, hello folks. Welcome to Chapter 5. We're moving now into the police, law enforcement. Police being the common shorthand way in which people refer to the general law enforcement. Then this is a pretty common thing. I know it's really early in the lecture to get into digression, but just, people talk about jail, people talk about police, people talk about courts. And those are broader concepts than that. So when we talk about the police here, we're talking about sheriffs, we're talking about federal law enforcement, we're talking about a lot of things. So, having said that and started the confusion, let's ask a few questions. Now, one of the questions would be, and this goes back to the point we talked about at the beginning of ethnocentrism, the idea of what happens in your life is what is normal, and chronocentrism, what happens in your time is normal. We're very used to seeing the police in a paramilitary structure. They have uniforms, they have guns, they have rank and insignia. Are there alternatives to this? Is this the right way to structure a civilian police force? Now, we're going to talk a little bit about diversity both in this one and the next chapter, but I thought I'd introduce the concept here. When we talk about diversity, what do we mean by it? What's the goal of diversity? Why do you want something to be diverse? And how do you measure diversity? What things should you measure? What things shouldn't be included in diversity? We don't want to seek diversity in this area, but we do in that. What about how we have practiced federalism, which is the breaking down really of our government into these different levels and our police law enforcement structure into federal, state, and local levels? How do you think this impacts relative efficiency, however you would measure that? What problems does the division of law enforcement create? And what does it solve? I mean, why do we have it, in other words? Okay, again, learning objectives, we're going to just skip over most of those. Now, your book, as it's wont to do, gives you a simple list and says, here are the responsibilities of the police, 1, 2, 3, 4. I beg you, whenever you're approaching a study of anything, not to think a list giving you by an author or lecturer like myself is exhaustive, that it has every responsibility or even the most important responsibilities. It could be the most important. I hope when I'm teaching it's the most important points that I'm covering, but everybody comes with a bit of a bias coming in and a perspective as well, maybe is a better way to put it. So your book. What is your book's idea about the 4 primary things related to the police, their responsibilities? 1, enforcing the law. Now, this is what we tend to think of when we think of the police. They're out there catching bad guys. But in fact, they spend, and we'll look at some numbers, a remarkably small amount of time actually enforcing laws. Providing services. Now, this is something that the police do most of the time. And it can be something as simple as directing traffic at an automobile crash or, answering a call. This tends to overshadow the crime fighting role. And this, by the way, will change over time. We'll talk about during the political area some of the things that the services police provided are pretty shocking to us in the modern world. Preventing crime. This is something that is kind of a predictive or proactive occupation of the police, the idea that police prevent crime. Again, it's an assumption that we make, and we'll examine some of those issues. Preserving the peace, and this can be related to preventing crime, but it also means handling the situation, hopefully not escalating it. Although sometimes it happens. Are there others? Sure. One of the things the police clearly do is they protect the status quo. The society creates a mechanism that can use force. That's the police. The police have the ability to lawfully use force, where most of us do not. And we let them exercise that force in preserving and protecting the structure of the society that we've agreed upon, if if we can admit for a moment or accept for a moment that we all agree upon the structure. So the police preserve the status quo for good and for bad. It enforces a moral code. Now, sometimes when I say this, my class goes, well, we don't want the cops enforcing morality. Well, I think you do. We believe that children need protection. So if a police officer is enforcing a code against beating a child or torturing a child, because it's a violation of the moral code that we're supposed to protect children, you wouldn't say, well, he's enforcing his own moral opinions there. That's a bad idea. Or even the moral opinions of the larger society. Now, there can be negative moral opinions, particularly as time passes and we recognize more problems. The police, not just in the South, in places like Indianapolis and New Jersey, enforced segregation. So this would be, the police arresting African Americans if they tried to sit at the front of the bus. Advancing political, economic, and social interests. So depending upon how these are distributed and how much power each group and politically or economically or socially has, the police, because they have the ability to use force, can advance or retard those interests. Okay, at the beginning. Crime control is not really the focus of early American police departments. To be honest about this, police departments are relatively new creatures. So if we go back 200 years, suppose you could go back to 1776, the founding of the American Republic. There's no police departments. There are sheriffs, which perform some of the functions. There's some night watch systems, but there's no police force. And I think this is driven, at least in part, by the structure of society. It was primarily a rural society, so sheriffs, which are more often associated with rural environments, are more common. The sheriffs, that's a very old office. Back in England, counties were called shires, S-H-I-R-E. Officials in the counties that performed some law enforcement functions, among others, were called reeves, R-E-E-V-E-S. So a shire reeve becomes the sheriff. So when America is settled, the colonists bring over the sheriff system. They bring over some of the night watch system to protect the community. But we're still a very rural people. It's only as population growth gets going, as we begin to have cities that have 50,000, 100,000, and then, shockingly, 1 million in them, that it becomes obvious we need a police force of some type. Now, so there is this kind of split between the rural and the urban in the United States. And the sheriffs, I've already talked about them, but there were other kind of rural organizations that operated as in a police-like manner. The posse out west. Now this has some very ancient roots, the posse comitatus. The Southern slave patrols. In order to maintain control over slaves, the South gradually almost militarized, in certain ways, the patrolling of the countryside. It was different in urban environments, and by urban this is going to be mainly the northern part of the United States, say from Pennsylvania to the East Coast, and then the Midwest part of the United States, say from basically Indianapolis through the Mississippi. There you had the development of large cities, and in those cities you had urban police departments and urban political machines, as they're called. Okay, let's talk about one of these earliest urban police departments, in fact, the earliest. England was the first country in the world to really industrialize. And by the 1820s, the population of London had skyrocketed. If you went back to London 200, 300, 400 years before this, there'd be 50 or 100,000 people in it, a relatively small city. But by the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, you were getting 1 million people or more in these cities. And it was very difficult to police. And in fact, the English government was sometimes forced to call in the troops and threaten people. It's called Reading the Riot Act, right? Threaten people to behave. And this was costly, inefficient, caused death and destruction of property. So Sir Robert Peel was appointed to essentially create an alternative to having to use the military. And he came up with the world's first police force. Now, it's pretty familiar to us in some ways. There's uniforms, there's ranks, so they took some of the paramilitary structure. But it was designed to be less violent, so no guns. And, one of the famous dictums or things that was said about this was the police were supposed to be the people, and the people were supposed to be the police. They were supposed to identify with one another. So this first modern police department is created around 1829 or 1830, we'll say. And he definitely wanted that the Bobbies, as they were called, named after Sir Robert, Robert's nickname is Bob, Sir Robert, these Bobbies, were supposed to be viewed as parts of the community, as helpers, not as lords and controllers. In America, cities took a little bit longer to get going. The Industrial Revolution started later in the United States. So, if you go back to 1776, the largest city in the United States is Philadelphia. It's primarily a port and trading city, though. There's not a lot of manufacturing. There's some light manufacturing, but not a lot. Fast forward 40, 50 years, now we're in the 1830s in the United States, these cities are getting big. Boston's going to form a police department in 1838. Philly's got one from 1833. New York claims an early one as well. By the 1860s, most of these northern cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, later and roughly contemporaneously, Chicago, Cincinnati, Columbus, Pittsburgh, and a little bit further south, Baltimore, New Orleans, they're going to start forming police departments. And they're going to take that London model, although they will have guns. Although not all of them at first. But the idea is less overt force. Now, because they're growing up at a time politically, these police departments, when government was driven in a very partisan manner, we call this the patronage system. What would literally happen is someone would get elected in a town, and if it was a change in party or factions, even in the same party, he might come in and fire everybody that worked for the city because he won, and he was going to put his boys in charge. So the chief of police would get fired, but not just the chief, the majors, the captains, the lieutenants, the sergeants, all the way down. And he would hire his own people to be the police. Very little training went on. But the police were seen as an arm of this political machine, so they did things that might surprise you, like they helped people find jobs. They ran soup kitchens. They ran hotels for transients. Yes, there was a lot of corruption that was associated with this, but it was also just seen as the way things were done. It was actually done pretty much the same way federally. So when there was a change in political party, when a new president was elected, what could happen, believe it or not, is everybody working for the post office got fired and whole new people got hired. Only a small sliver were not part of what was called the spoils system. Well, there were obvious problems with this, particularly with the police. So right around the 1930s, a man named Auguste Vermeer and others said, we need to take the police out of this patronage political model and reform it. We want the police to be professionals, and we're going to not have a political hack running them. We're going to take a police chief who has been trained in scientific techniques and policing, and he's going to run the department. We're also, so that we're not just attracting people that are there to make money, we're going to give cops better salaries and better working conditions. And ultimately, as things went on, we're going to hire more women and minorities for different reasons. But we're not going to be focused on integrating with the public very much. We're going to professionalize the police by removing them from what was seen as the corruption of the political era. There were some problems with this because by the 1960s it was pretty obvious that the police had lost touch with a lot of the general public, particularly anybody that didn't look like them. So when the riots of the 1960s rolled around, um, when African Americans, or even earlier when the riots in California with Hispanics, or the riot in New York City with Stonewall riots with some LGBT. There was no connection. There was no way you could deal with it. Now, the example I used in class was in Indianapolis during this reform era. There was a serial killer called BTK, Bind, Torture, Kill, and his primary victims were gay men. And when the Indianapolis Police Department wanted to solve this, they tried to go to the gay community and say, hey, cooperate with us, give us information, tell us when you're meeting, tell us who's there. The problem is the Indianapolis Police Department had been so harsh on the homosexual community in Indianapolis that they had no connections. In fact, they would out them, arrest them, harass them. So when they said, hey, give us information on where you're meeting and when you're meeting and who's gay, it's like, no, we're not going to do that. So there was a necessity for change. And really starting in the 60s, but really starting to peak in the 80s, we have the community era where we're going to reform this. We're going to devote a lot of resources to going back to Sir Robert Peel's The Public of the Police and the Police of the Public, community relationships. We're going to build local community trusts. Now, it's unfair when I talk about the patronage and the reform and the community area to think that somewhere there's a switch that's thrown and every part of the reform era disappears when you go to community, or when the reform era comes in, every part of the patronage system disappears. That's simply not true. Bits and pieces of everything carry on. So, for example, if you looked at the North Carolina Highway Patrol, when a new governor gets elected, okay, even though it's not the patronage era, he typically will appoint a new head of the Highway Patrol and some of his senior officers because they're not protected by civil service protection. So there'll be a decapitation. They'll bring in, now usually it's promoting internally, but they will bring in a whole new crop of people. When I said the community work started, okay, it doesn't mean that they got rid of professionalism. So these things tended to develop evolutionarily as opposed to just a radical break. So you have a cycle of reform, a perception of corruption, and then you have more reform. And this goes on and on and on. Anytime a system is created, okay, it gets mature, and then people criticize it. It says it needs reform. So you reform it, so you've created it again, it matures, and then you reform it. And often organizations will stray from their original intent because society has changed. And police departments are no exception to this. So they will move between crime control and due process, even inside these different cycles. Okay, policing today in the 21st century. The term, the kind of the buzzword you hear, is intelligence-led policing. So we're in some ways this is going back to a professional model. In other ways, it's still retaining a lot of the community integration. There's a lot of emphasis, particularly after 9/11, although I think that might be waning, on counterterrorism. And there's certainly a lot of evidence, and this is going forward, on surveillance. So there are many cities. London is a good example. If you're in London, you're almost always on a camera in some way, shape, or form. And that's true in a lot of northern cities and large cities in the United States. You're almost always on a public camera. So many law enforcement experts believe the 9/11 attacks ended the community era. I don't think it ended it so much as it changed it, led to an evolution. So one of the things that happened, and I think this is just an impact from the rise of computers and data, is that we began to expect the police to be more proactive. And you can see this when you watch the weather forecast on TV. I know it's a weird analogy, but stick with me for a second. Um, the weather technically is put your hand outside and see if it's raining. What you're seeing on TV is a prediction of the weather. And I remember my mother, who's was born more than 90 years ago, telling me that they used to laugh at the weathermen because they were so bad at predicting the weather. They would get it wrong so often because they only had very primitive tools. They had a limited amount of data. But as many problems as we have now, we just had a big hurricane hit New Orleans. Maybe a dozen people died or so. That's terrible. But if you look at hurricanes hitting the East Coast of the United States or the Gulf Coast, you've got the Galveston hurricane that killed more than 1,000 people because there was no way to predict it. So we begin to kind of say to ourselves, both in the policing and out of the policing, hey, let's let the police make use of things like data to deploy resources and respond to crimes. So an example I saw recently, I was watching a brief segment on Milan in Italy, where a police officer went out and he modeled where certain types of robberies occur and when they occur. And then he went to his bosses and said, hey, here's this data. If we put officers in those areas at that time, we can stop those robberies. And they did. They managed to lower this type of robbery, it was robbery of pharmacies, by about 50%, which is pretty amazing. And they did it in less than a year. Now there's a yin and a yang here. There's a cost for this because do you want the police to get all this data? Do you want them to constantly be able to watch you and know what you're doing? Some people say, I don't want to live in a fishbowl. I want to live in a free society. I don't want to have everybody know what I'm doing. Another split that underlies the modern police is The Rise of the Warrior Cop. That's a fairly famous book that came out a few years ago. And this is really the idea of, one of the areas in American society that most people will say is successful and support is the military. So it's even when the military fails, when it retreats. For example, we retreated from Afghanistan. People will say, well, it's not the military's fault. It's the politicians' fault. Military didn't lose Vietnam. Military didn't lose Afghanistan. The politicians lost Afghanistan. We in the United States tend to, and this is legitimate, I'm not criticizing it, we tend to honor and glorify the warrior, the cop, the soldier. So it shouldn't come as a surprise if you're looking for a model of something to structure your police on that you go to this model that's popular. And if you look at how cops' uniforms have changed, they become more warlike. They're wearing more vests. They have more tactical gear. Now, the alternative to this is the guardian. This is the non-confrontational approach. This is the cop that's integrated into the community, not to police it, but to protect it. So you're seeing in some American cities today where you have these, they're not police officers per se, but they're functioning in some ways in some of the areas of policing, where they're trying to de-escalate violence, where they're talking to the community. They're not armed. They're integrated. Okay, a little bit about terrorism. Now, the problem with terrorism, and this goes back to this chrono and ethnocentrism, is many people think, well, terrorism is new, and terrorism is Muslim fundamentalists blowing up things. Well, you're wrong. First of all, you're wrong because there's nothing new about terrorism in the United States. If you went to the turn of the last century, from 1900 to 1901, there were terrorists running around. They tended to be, if we look in the urban environments, they tended to be anarchists who were blowing up things and destroying things, killing people, assassinating people. There were bombs placed in Wall Street. If you think about the largest terrorist group in the United States that is responsible for killing the greatest number of people, it's clearly the Ku Klux Klan. There's no other way to describe the KKK except as a terrorist group. It's a group outside of society which resorts to violence to obtain a social goal, social, economic, and political goal. And between about 1866, when it's created, and there are different clans, there's what's called the first, the second, the third clan. The Klan kills thousands of people, rapes them, burns houses, burns crosses, destroys property, does terrible things. So there's nothing new about terrorism. Terrorism already exists. So the perception today is that the terrorist groups that are a threat are foreigners, and that's not correct, but that's the perception. Most terrorists are domestic. They almost always are in every society. You do have foreign terrorists coming in, but it's so much easier to blame foreigners for your problems. Like, I'm reading a book about the First World War right now, and it talks about how the English were afraid there were German terrorists blowing up docks and stuff, and there wasn't anything of the sort going on. So the perception is that it's foreigners. That's not correct. The other current perception is that the left-wing groups are more violent, that they're the more serious threats. And we can see this because the police departments, for example, when Occupy Wall Street was a movement in the early 2000s, and by 2008, the police departments across the United States infiltrated them, spied on them. Today, if you read the FBI reports and other domestic agency reports, it's not the left wing that tend to be the most violent, the best armed. It's the right wing. So yes, Antifa is a threat. It's not a terrorist threat. It is a group in opposition. You have other groups on the right, Proud Boys and others, that seem to be more violent and more dangerous. Frequent debates exist as to, are the police neutral towards groups, or do they tend to favor right-wing groups? And the answer is yes, they tend to favor right-wing groups. Now, here's one of those instances where some of you are nodding your head and saying, oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, you're right, Mr. Chapman. And others of you saying, oh, you are so full of it, Mr. Chapman. Okay, this is where you can go out and explore the numbers. Don't take my perspective, right? Look at the data. Okay, so let's find out how many people. Pick a time frame. How many people have committed what crimes during what years? What have they done? Who have they done? Who are they? Are they foreigners? Well, yeah, there were foreigners. Don't forget, 9/11. Okay, I'll grant you that. 9/11's a big single incident. But after that 20 years, what have you got? How many cases of foreigners coming in do you have? How many cases of the left killing people do you have? How many cases of the right do you have killing people? Don't just take my word for it, because I may be full of it. You need to go out and find this yourself. All right, now let's drop away from the sort of political a little bit and talk more about the cops and talk about their training. I often get questions from students, hey, I want to be a police officer, what do I need? And there are some basic things you need. The first thing that's going to happen is they're going to run a criminal record check on you. And if you have a serious felony conviction, if you rape someone, murder someone, committed a burglary, the odds of you getting hired as a police officer are very low. You're going to take psychology exams. Now, they don't want to hire someone who's obviously a schizophrenic or obviously mentally unstable, manic depressive, say. They're going to run driving checks and record checks and credit checks on you, all looking for stability. Now, interestingly enough, and this is a complete aside, recently, I believe it was up in New Haven, the police department up there put a cap on intelligence. They didn't want to hire people above a certain above. I want to emphasize it is above. And I had so much fun with this with my cop friends when this came out. Above a certain level, because they said, look, if you're that smart, you'll get too bored with this job. Now, I don't think that's really true, and I think New Haven is missing the boat. But boy, I haven't let some of my friends in the Raleigh Police Department forget that one. Okay, so what are your basic requirements? U.S. citizen. Okay, driver's license, You have to meet certain physical requirements, weight, eyesight. Those can be correctable. You're going to run these background checks. You're going to have tests. About 94% of all police applicants are high school graduates or college graduates. Not 84% are high school, mandatory to be, and 10% have college. Now, take Raleigh for example. Most everybody I know that works for Raleigh, and I used to teach this in other classes at the Raleigh Police Academy and different satellite, you're not going to get promoted above master officer, which is basically corporal, if you don't have at least a 2-year degree. Most police officers you meet have at least a 2-year degree. Many of them, the sergeants and above, have 4-year degrees. Once you get up to the majors and the captains, you begin to run into officers with masters. And it's not unusual at all to run across chiefs of police and higher officials that have PhDs. Another requirement, you got to be 21 years old. There can be educational requirements. There can be no felony convictions as well. Once training starts, what happens? Well, there's really 2 parts of your training. Your academy training, where you go to a academy like the Raleigh Police Academy up off of Capitol Boulevard, where you're going to learn the essential parts of police work, how to fill out reports, laws on search and seizure, interrogations, weapons training, how to secure a crime scene, first aid, all this stuff. After that, and that can last, it depends from different departments, might be 6 months, might be a year. A year would be very long. You graduate and you are assigned an FTO, field training officer. You're the rookie. He trains you to apply what you learned to the streets. Now, some police departments, the smaller one, don't have academies. They don't have a budget for it. So what they do is they, in North Carolina at least, to explain that model to you, you will take BLET, basic law enforcement training. Often you are sponsored by a police department. Like say Lizard Lick wants to hire you. They contact Wake Tech. They say, hey, we want to hire John Doe or Jane Doe, and we're going to sponsor them. So you go through BLET at Wake Tech, you graduate, and now you're field trained. Women and minority in policing today. So over the past 20 years, many police departments, actually this is probably longer, closer to 30 or 40 years, have really made efforts to recruit African American, Hispanic, Asian Americans, women, and other minorities. And some of this is done for via the term affirmative action, which I'll address in a minute, or because of anti-discrimination laws or settlements. So discrimination by law enforcement violates federal law. Discrimination occurs when an individual's characteristics, their gender or their race, impacts hiring and promotion. And since 1970s, as I said, we've had in some departments affirmative action. So what's affirmative action? It is not hiring someone who's unqualified. Basically the way, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but basically the way affirmative action works is you must meet the basic standards to be hired. So let's suppose you interview and test and evaluate 100 candidates, and only 50 of those candidates meet those requirements. So the other 50 don't get considered. Now, of the 50 left, that's the pool that could be subject to an affirmative action. Now, of course, women going through this self-report and in studies are supported that they feel they have to prove themselves. And there is a bias by some male police officers, maybe many or most, who feel that female police officers are soft or weak and not suited. There's no good data really to support that. Most of this seems to be based on a prejudgment, a prejudice, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of difference in their performance overall. So again, what's this affirmative action? We've got the body. Essentially what you do is you say, we're going to give incentives to hire groups that are underrepresented in our police department. And this could be really important. Let me give you an example that I think might be coming in the future. As of today, about 100,000 Afghanis have been fled Afghanistan after our defeat. And many of those are going to settle in the United States. So let's suppose you had, of their 50 candidates, you had 5 candidates who met all the qualifications, but um, they spoke the language of whatever. I mean, there's a ton of different languages, Pashtun and stuff, in Afghanistan. But let's suppose they spoke the common language of a large settlement in Raleigh. Um, would you give them preference to be hired? Would you give it an affirmative action? Or let's suppose you knew, well, we have almost no female police officers, and ethnic Afghans really are very sensitive to males interacting with females in any sort of, I don't want to say sexual, in any sort of close or intimate contact. It works much better to have females, this was true during the war, but female police officers deal with um, Afghanis, Afghan women. So could you give them, since you don't have many in your department, could you give them a preference to hire them? That's what affirmative action is. You're going to give incentives to hire groups that are underrepresented. Now, this can be unconstitutional. This is not completely settled law, and this has really been rolled back the last 20, 30 years. It's still on the books, but it's not that common. All right, Minority Report, race and ethnicity. Well, if we've got the issue of gender, what about the issue of race? And what about the issue of ethnics? White police officers will often, much like when they think about women, will believe that minority officers give their own races preferential treatment. And of course, minority groups in our society can, face hostility from their own community. They can be perceived as traitors or Uncle Toms. So there is that delicate edge. Again, the evidence is not very good. As a matter of fact, I would say it's quite poor that ethnic minority police officers under-police ethnic communities. So is there a benefit for a diverse police force? I would like to say instinctively yes, that the integrated police force develops better relationships with a racially diverse citizenry, that it helps us solve crimes. I'd like to see more data supporting that, though. I'd really like to see some really good really good studies that could lay to rest the idea that diverse police forces are good or bad. Because there's not a tremendous amount of peer-reviewed work. The common wisdom says, yes, it works better. But I hope one of the things I'm teaching in this class is to always be a little bit hesitant when we start talking about, oh, well, everybody knows this is true. All right, now we're going to look at some quick numbers here. There's about 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States, and that varies all the way from tiny little police departments like Mayberry RFD that's got Barney and Andy, I guess I'm dating myself, all the way up to huge police departments like New York City, which have tens of thousands of officers. In total, there's about 88,000, so let's just say 900,000 sworn law enforcement officers in the United States. They operate on 3 different levels: local, state, and federal. The locals are the vast bulk. They're 60+%, 70%. And they're divided themselves into 2, and I've already mentioned this. You got municipal, which are your police. They work in small and medium-sized police departments. There's some that are huge, like New York City or Philadelphia or Chicago or LA, but most are medium to small size. Then you got your sheriffs, and there's a lot of sheriff's department. There's 100 counties in North Carolina. There are 100 sheriffs. Each one of those sheriffs has deputy sheriffs he hires. The bigger these sheriff's departments are, the more they can do different stuff. And different states have the sheriffs do different stuff. So obviously they investigate crimes. They also do civil process. In other words, they serve lawsuits. They can be charged with collecting taxes, maintaining the county jail. We do that here. Keeping order in the courthouse. Again, we do that here. Enforcing orders of the court. We do that here. It's more political than you might think. Certainly more political than the police. Overtly political. And they do a lot. And now, not as much in urban North Carolina. If you're talking the big urban counties like Mecklenburg, which has got Charlotte, or Wake, which has Raleigh, or even Durham, that has Durham, the sheriff's departments are political. But if you really want to see political and how important they are, go outside. Go to these smaller counties like Northampton County, Pender County, Mitchell County, and you'll see that the sheriff is a big, big deal in that county. So you've got large cities like Raleigh, you've got smaller towns like Fuquay, you've got counties like Wake County Sheriff's Department, and then you've got coroners. Now, 9 of our counties actually elect coroners. Most of the time, they're appointed. All right, once you go up to the state level, there's kind of a split. About half the states, they have a single police agency that does everything. 23 states are like that. So if you took Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania has the Pennsylvania State Police. And the Pennsylvania State Police does everything that the North Carolina Highway Patrol does, and everything that the State Bureau of Investigation does, and the state, everything. On the other hand, about half, 26, of the states break it up. So we have in North Carolina, we're one of the ones that's broken up, we have a Highway Patrol, and we have an SBI. There is the, I'll let you look at that, and you can freeze screen if you need to. There's the current structure of the North Carolina Department of Public Safety. And you see, in theory, the governor's the head, and those are the different agencies underneath it. What about the feds? Well, there's a lot of federal agencies, and some of these are very familiar to you. I mean, if I scroll down this list here, I mean, the FBI. Oh, yeah, I've heard of them. The Marshal Service, yeah. The Secret Service, yeah, I've heard of them. Central Intelligence Agency, okay. Border Patrol, I heard of them. Coast Guard Investigation Service, never heard of them. So you can see that there are some on that list that you haven't heard of, but can be really important. And some you probably never heard of till recently, like the U.S. Capitol Police. You know, they were after the January 6th insurrection. They've really come to the forefront. So you can see that there's lots and lots of different federal agencies. The 3 primary ones are under the big departments. These are cabinet offices. Homeland Security, which is a pretty new one. Department of Justice, which is very old, and Department of Treasury, which is more than 2 centuries old. So, Department of Homeland Security was formed after 9/11. What they did after 9/11 was they said, let's take a lot of these different police agencies and stick them in one department. So they took border, they took immigration, Secret Service, Coast Guard, FEMA, TSA, they put all those. By raw number, this is the largest number of law enforcement. However, the Justice Department in 2001 had the FBI, DEA, and alcohol, tobacco, and firearms under its control. And there was a fight. Should we put all these police under the Homeland Security? Let's put them under security. What are they doing under Justice? I mean, Justice should be lawyers. But the Attorney General is a very powerful political figure. And the Department of Justice was having none of that. And the big fight, and when the dust settled, these stayed under Department of Justice. So even though the Attorney General of the United States is essentially like a district attorney, he controls the FBI, the DEA, and the ATF, and U.S. Marshal. Finally, you've got Treasury, which has internal revenue. They've got about 3,000 agents, which is not an insubstantial amount. More than that, twice as many, there are 10,000 firms that provide private security. And this is a secondary policing, as it's called, and it's seen as cost effective if you can afford it. So this started off with companies doing this for on-site security, and it's really spread to things like, if you have got a rich, affluent neighborhood and you want more police to patrol it, well, you could say, well, let's pass a tax increase, that's popular, and we'll take some money from the tax revenue and we'll hire more cops. Well, yeah, I really don't want to do that. Tell you what I want to do. I'm going to get together with everybody in the neighborhood. We're going to gate the neighborhood. We're going to hire a private security to run it, gated communities. So this raises interesting questions about the money in police. I think something that we should talk about. All right, that's about 45 minutes. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. When you're ready, you can sign on to chapter 6.